Well, good afternoon. Happy Thursday, and welcome to the Insurance Journal's Academy of Insurance's weekly webinar after show. I am George Jack. I'm your host on the weekly webinar, and I'm happy to be the host of our after show as well. And with me today is not only our instructor for today's webinar, but the director of the Academy of Insurance as well, Mr. Patrick Raitt. And Patrick, I wanted to ask you what you thought of today's webinar, how it went, and in your previous work incarnations, how much did you write commercial general liability policies, and is this a subject that's near and dear to your heart, I guess?
Yeah, thanks, George. I thought I thought it went real well today. I felt like a fast hour, like there was probably bit off almost more than what we could handle in the amount of time that we had. I felt a little bad when I got to the additional insureds and there was 15 minutes left, and I knew I had more that I wanted to say, but it just to get it through it. Of course, we do have other sessions specific to additional insureds, but my background as an underwriter for fire departments, we wrote comprehensive policies for them. So we had their property and their liability and other lines too. So while I've been away in some ways, focusing more on property the last several years. I appreciate the liability policy. I like the complexity of the issues that can come up with a liability policy, and it's a lot of fun to me.
And that sort of leads me into my next question, because at the top of the hour, you decided you took the class in a different direction, and you started talking about endorsements. And you said you're going to emphasize talking about one endorsement in particular, the CG 2026-1219. I was wondering, was that, I mean, I think you picked it because it was the most involved, but also was it something that you wrote a lot of? Is it a sentimental thing? Is it one of the first ones you did? So you wanted to give it some love, or what was the story?
It probably because that additional insured endorsement above all others has evolved the most over my career. I mentioned in our session today that when I first ran into it, we used that endorsement for 9 out of 10 additional insureds at the time when I was dealing with fire departments. And we recognized that the endorsement itself was very vague in the way it was written. And at the time, for those that are insurance form nerds, at the time we were using the 1185 edition, which was very open. There wasn't a lot to it. And as we would publish these endorsements, add them to policies, we would actually add wording in for very specific reasons that the entity was being added as additional insured. What would often happen is many volunteer fire departments around the country, they'd host a parade in the summertime, and they would add the city or the town as additional insured specific to that. And so we would have additional insured endorsements that would say town of Bath or town of Cortland or town of city of Concord as additional insured with respects to the Founders Day parade, the Dairy Festival parade, the annual fire parade, and give specific dates. And we would using that endorsement, we would try and restrict it with what we put on it. Now over time, that endorsement has become much more restrictive, and I use that as kind of a jumping off point because many of the current additional insured endorsements have very similar language. I also restrict the additional insured status to the ongoing operations of the named insured or for specific locations and things like that.
Gotcha. You'd mentioned something about joint ventures in the talk, and in Christopher Boggs's book, PNC Concepts, which is on sale in the Academy bookstore for, thought I'd mention that for some reason. Uh, a joint venture can be two different companies. Like it can be a manufacturer and a different company that come together to achieve the same thing, like manufacturing or distribution of a product in a way that the market can't do. If an employees can be covered under one company that's part of a joint venture. If an employee, I just had this question came up in my mind. If somebody is doing a day shift at one company covered by one company joint venture, and a night shift by another company covered under that joint venture, would they be double covered under the CGL? I thought I'd
Well,
I thought I'd lob that at you.
nice. I like that. That's thoughtful. That's deep. That's next level stuff.
I'm trying.
Uh, man. So if the joint venture, it's got its own policy, and those entities that are part of the joint venture, they're insured as well, because they are there. It's as the joint venture itself owns the policy, it's insured, and then all the entities that are a part of that joint venture, they're insured as well, and then the employees of those entities are insured because they're, in a way, they're the employees of the joint venture.
Right.
And so yeah, there's coverage in both spots there. But now,
Okay.
what is uh, what's critical to understand is that if, when you come together on a joint venture, that joint venture needs its own policy, because the policies for those other entities, that will exclude that new joint venture specifically. So it's got to have its own coverage there.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Wow. That was quick. I like that. I wasn't sure. Um, so you mentioned that we came up against it at the top of the hour. We had a lot to cover. What didn't we cover in today's talk that you wanted to do in the sequel?
Um, Mostly just kind of rush through those additional insured endorsements. I wanted to repeat the idea that some of that language that we talked about at the very beginning of the additional insured section, the limitation of coverage to the policy limit, or if there's a contract in place, the contract, or if there's a law requiring there to be a cap on liability losses. So in a lot of jurisdictions, they've passed some level of tort reform, where those, the tort reform laws cap certain losses for some entities, maybe not all. And if there is that in place, then it doesn't matter what the policy says, that cap, if the policy has a higher limit, then all that's collectible is that legal cap there. um, and I want to make sure to repeat some of that, because on every current edition of these additional insured endorsements, there is that limitation of, we'll pay out the policy limit unless there's a law or a contract that requires less, in which case we'll pay less. And then, of course, to remember that if there's a contract that requires more than the policy limit, it could be the contract requires a $2 million occurrence limit. Well, and the policy may have a $500,000 cap or $1 million occurrence limit, in which case then the insured needs an excess policy or an umbrella policy to cover that next layer, so that they're not in violation of their contract. That's one of the issues that comes up with that language there.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. And next Thursday, you are not going to be the instructor, but
No,
Frank Panaccio is, and our class next week is going to be how to keep work comp costs from spiraling out of control. And I wondered if you'd like to say a couple of things about that in closing for today's after show.
actually, that's interesting that we've got Frank next week, because he's got that idea of keeping the workers' comp costs from getting out of control, and that's going to be a lot about potentially the back to work type scenarios. How are we going to keep people from over leaning on their workers' comp benefits and really coming back to work. And it's really good that he's doing that next week, because 2 weeks later, he's also doing a session on workers' comp basics that we haven't had in our catalog. And I was kind of surprised. We've got such a great workers' comp catalog that we don't have anything that says, here's kind of the down and dirty, the basics of that, that workers' comp policy. What, how does workers' comp work? Where did it come from? And workers'
Right.
comp's a fantastic and really fascinating system. And I'm glad we've got two sessions, both with Frank, coming up here in this month.
And I'll put this in the funny you should ask department or bucket. Don't we have a new publication or coming out soon relating to that subject?
Funny you should ask. Actually, it's not a new one, but we're in the process of updating and just kind of cleaning up and putting out to a new uh, in a new format, where the insurance professionals guide to, let's see, workers comp. I've got the a printed out copy of some of it, working on editing through it, and we're bringing that up onto the Amazon platform, so to make it easier for folks to get hold of and purchase, and that's coming very soon.
Excellent. Well segued. All right.
Bravo, bravo,
Uh,
sir.
well, Patrick, on behalf of the Academy and our director, Patrick Gray, I'd like to say thank you very much for having attended this week's webinar. And we will look forward to next week's after show after July 16th, how to keep workers' comp costs from spiraling out of control with our instructor, Mr. Frank Panaccio. So thanks very much, everybody, and happy Thursday and have a great weekend.
Thanks, George.